So now the present day philosophers, so the first passage, so the present day philosophers usually envision their discipline as in, so that's the case, just the case. Yeah. So the present day philosophers usually envision their, I'll use the highlighter. Okay. So the present day philosophers usually envision their discipline as an endeavor that has been since antiquity. Okay. Or I change the format. Okay. So since antiquity, distinct from and superior to any particular intellectual discipline, such as theology or science. Now, what is this? Are you able to understand anything? So when I read it for the first time, even my was like this. He, oh God, I thought that the author, you are my friend. Now, what is this? I thought you're going to support me during my CAT exams, but what you have written, I'm not able to understand anything. Okay. So, but anyhow, this particular thing will not going to work while we are reading the CAT passages. Okay. So, we need to comprehend them. So, let's go get back and let's start again. Okay. So, the one thing is clear from reading this particular passage is that this is actually the opinion of present day philosophers. Okay. So, it is not the author's opinion. Okay. So, it is present day philosophers. Okay. Who usually envision their discipline since antiquity. Now you need to know the meaning of this word antiquity. Okay, so antiquity is something which is very long time ago. Okay, so they believe that their discipline for the philosophers would always be, so what would be the discipline of the philosophers? The philosophers discipline would be definitely a, I would write it here rather, so the philosophers discipline would definitely be philosophy. Oh, just a second, sir. I need to change it. Okay. So, what will be the philosopher's discipline? It will be, again, what I'm doing. Okay. So, again, their discipline will be philosophy. Okay. So, what they believe. Okay. So, what the philosophers actually believe about their particular this. Okay. So, they believe that the philosophy since antiquity, that is since very long time, is distinct from superior to any is distinct from and superior to any particular intellectual discipline. Okay, so this is a view, this is the main idea of this particular passage. Okay, so what is the main idea? So it is actually, first of all, it is not the view of the author, it is actually the view of the present day philosophers. So they believe that philosophy, which is their discipline, okay, it is since very long time, it is actually distinct and it is actually superior to any other discipline. Okay, such philosophical concerns as the mind body problem, or more generally the nature of human knowledge, they believe are basic human questions whose tentative philosophical solution have served as the necessary foundation on which all other intellectual speculation has rested. Okay, so again, a kind of a repetition of whatever the author has said in the very first paragraph, the very first the lines, I would rather say is okay, okay. So let's just quickly write it in a form of a notes. Okay, so just quickly write it in the form of a note. So what I can say it from this is that what philosophers actually believe is that philosophy, which is their discipline, okay, so it is super awesome. Okay, so it is best, it is awesome. Okay, and it is best or it is awesome because of two reasons. First of all, it is distinct, can I say it is distinct, and the second, it is actually superior to other disciplines. Okay, and these two are happening since antiquity. Okay, so that means that these two are happening since a very long time ago. This is something which is not a new concept, it is happening since a very long time ago. So this is actually the, we would say, a main gist of the first paragraph. Okay, so let's get into the second paragraph. Okay, so let me just use this. Okay, so basis for this view, okay, however, lies in a serious misinterpretation of the past. Okay, see, so now the author has started getting involved. Okay, so what is saying that the basis for this view? Now what is this view? The view of the philosophers. Okay, so this view, however, lies in a serious misinterpretation of the past. So we said that we are started feeling that now the author has actually started getting involved in the passage. Okay, so the earlier was the just the philosopher's view, now this is actually the author's view. Okay, now author is saying now we know that lies in a serious misinterpretation of the fact Now these words are telling us that the author is presenting this particular thing, that the author is rather giving a negative evaluation about the present day philosopher's view. So what he's saying, that the present day philosopher's view is incorrect. Okay, so let's see what is the issue with this discipline, okay, and what is the author's opinion about it. Okay, so the basis for this view, however, lies in a serious misinterpretation of the past, a projection of modern concerns onto past events. The idea of an autonomous discipline called philosophy, distinct from and sitting in judgment. So now let's see, distinct from, he's again giving, the author is giving the view, what is his view about the distinct from, and sitting on judgment on such pursuits as theology and science, turns out on close examination to be of quite recent origin. Okay, so we saw that the present day philosophers, they believe that their philosophy is actually distinct and superior on, this is actually happening since antiquity. But what the author is saying, that the present day philosophy, that the philosophy is distinct from and sitting in judgments on other, turns out on close examination to be of quite recent origin. Okay, and that is the reason that the author is saying that there lies a serious misinterpretation of the past. So two things are clear till now, is that the author is not favoring the present day philosopher's opinion. Okay, rather he's saying that the present day the rather the author is saying that the philosophy is something which is of quite recent origin. It is not since antiquity. There is something wrong in it. Okay, now since we can see that the this particular passage actually deals with a time period somewhat. Okay, so it is really important, okay, so to keep this kinds of dates into consideration. Okay, so the dates are important. So while in the 17th century, let's again get into this mode. So while in the 17th century, Descartes and Hobbes rejected medieval, so let me just highlight it. Okay, 17th century. Okay, so while in the 17th century, Descartes and Hobbes rejected medieval philosophy, they did not think of themselves as modern philosophers do, as proposing a new and better philosophy, but rather as furthering the warfare between science and theology. They were fighting, albeit discreetly, to open the intellectual world to the new science and to liberate intellectual life from ecclesiastical philosophy, and envision their work as contributing to the growth not of philosophy but of research in mathematics and physics. The link between, now I'm giving it like this, but of research in mathematics and physics. This link between philosophical interest and scientific practice persisted until the 19th century. Now we got one more time period, okay, when decline in ecclesiastical power over scholarship and changes in the nature of science provoked the final separation from both. Okay, so can you see now what is the author trying to say here? Okay, so the author is trying to say that it is only in the 19th century, okay, rather it is only in the 19th century that the final separation of philosophy actually happens. Okay, so it is not in the 17th century. Okay, so till the 17th century, the Descartes or the Hobbes, which are the medieval philosophers at that point of a time, okay, so they were actually getting into the warfare between science and theology. So they were not like considering as working towards the growth of a philosophy, but they were more interested in the research in mathematics and physics. Okay, so it is only in the 19th century that the final separation of the philosophy from mathematics and physics actually happens. Okay, so let's see what are the key words out here. Okay, so like again, see, let's see some of the words here. Okay, so when in the 17th century, Descartes and Hobbes rejected medieval philosophy, they did not think of themselves as modern philosophers do. Okay, so the modern as proposing a new and better philosophy, but rather as furthering the warfare between science and theology. Okay, so the modern philosophers believe that Descartes and the Hobbes actually contributed to the 17th century, but they were not kind of interested towards the building up a new and a better philosophy. Rather, they were getting into the warfare between science and theology. Okay, they were actually fighting from, so ecclesiastical, what is this? Ecclesiastical philosophy. Okay, now this ecclesiastical philosophy is something related to Christianity. Okay, so they were actually working on getting the philosophy different from the Christianity philosophy. Okay, and it was actually in the 19th century that the final separation of philosophy happens. Okay, so they were, so we can say that the earlier philosophers were focused more on a research in mathematics and physics. Okay, so again, what we can say is that, let's say in case if I have to write the keyword or the gist of the passage, so I can say that I know about the author's opinion here. So the author is saying that the philosophy is not something which is since antiquity, it is something which is of a recent origin. Okay, so this is the one key here. And to justify this, he has actually given us some examples. Like in the 17th century, the philosophers more involved towards the research in mathematics and physics rather than creating the philosophy as a unique or the altogether a different subject, and philosophy as a new this particular thing as a new or the a new course or a new, let's say, I would say, what are the word I can use, as a new discipline. Okay, it actually happens in the 19th century. Okay, so again, the main point here is the author's opinion that the philosophy is not of a recent origin as being proposed by the present day philosophers. And to justify this particular claim, he's saying that this happens in the 19th century and but not in the 17th century as which is being thought by the present day philosophers. Okay, so I hope you are there with me till this thing. Okay, so let's get into the last paragraph of the passage before we move on to the questions. Okay, so the demarcation of philosophy from science was facilitated. Let me just take the highlighter. The demarcation of philosophy from science was facilitated by the development in the early 19th century. Now again, the same line, okay, the same line. It is a kind of a repetition of the above line, okay, that the scientific practice persisted until the 19th century. It's kind of a repetition, okay. Now, where I was lost, okay. Yeah. So the demarcation of philosophy from science was facilitated by the development in the early 19th century of a new notion that philosophy's core interest should be epistemology. Okay. So now they say that the philosophy as a discipline actually appears in the 19th century because of their interest in the epistemology. Now, what is this epistemology? It is actually, you could say, it's a part of philosophy that actually deals with the knowledge. Okay, so generally, in case, just to give you a little bit gyan, okay, so the philosophy has got a 5 areas. One is the metaphysics, second is the epistemology, third is the logics, fourth is the aesthetics, and the fifth is in ethics. Okay, so they say that the philosophies actually get into the shape, okay, because of their core interest in epistemology. Okay, the general explanation of what it means to know something, that is actually the study of knowledge. Okay, modern philosophers now trace that notion back at least to Descartes and Spinoza, but it was not explicitly articulated until the late 18th century by Kant, okay, and did not become built into the structure of academic institutions and the standard self descriptions of philosophy professors until the late 19th century. Okay, so the language is no doubt it's difficult, okay, but we need to know the main ideas. That is really important. We need to know the overall picture. Okay, so still again, what we can actually infer from this particular passage is that the philosophy as a discipline emerged in the 19th century, and that too because of the philosophy's core interest in epistemology, and that was somewhere done by this gentleman named as Kant. Okay, so he focuses on something known as epistemology, which actually gives the foundational stone for philosophy. Okay, so without the idea of the epistemology, the survival of philosophy in an age of modern science is hard to imagine. Okay, so this epistemology, which was being proposed by the Kant, actually gave the birth to the philosophy. Metaphysics philosophy is traditional code considered as the most general description of how the heavens and the earth are put together, has been rendered almost completely meaningless by the spectacular progress of physics. Okay, so they have this metaphysics concept in the philosophy I just told you right now. Okay, so they were actually rendered as an incorrect, okay, by the physics people. So the philosophy was about to end by that area, but then the gentleman Kant came and he started giving us something about the epistemology, which gives a rebirth to the philosophy. Okay, so Kant, however, by focusing philosophy on the problem of knowledge, so the problem of knowledge is actually a part of an epistemology, managed to replace metaphysics with epistemology, and thus to transform the notion of philosophy as a queen of sciences into the new notion of philosophy as a separate foundational and discipline. Okay, so again, the author, so in case if I have to just give you a quick recap or the important pointers here in this passage. So we can say that the third paragraph, can I write it here in case it's visible to you? Okay, chalo, anyhow, I'll write it on white space. Okay. So what is the third paragraph actually talks about? Again, it is actually giving the justification to the author's point that the philosophy is not something which is of antiquity, but it is something which is of a recent origin. Okay. So he's saying that the philosophy actually emerged as a recent as a separate discipline, okay, by this gentleman Kant, okay, which actually moved from metaphysics concept to the epistemology, and this epistemology has actually given new notion of philosophy as a separate and a foundational discipline. Okay, so in case if I have to just quickly recap of whatever we have read so far, so we can conclude that there are two, one view is presented, okay, and that view is of the present day philosophers. So the present day philosophers believe that their discipline, that is philosophy, okay, it is superior, okay, and it is distinct from other disciplines. It is superior and it is distinct from other disciplines, and this is happening since antiquity, that is, it is happening since long time ago. But then the author is contradicting this view. The author is saying that this is not happening since long time, but it is rather of a recent origin, okay, and then he's actually giving us the examples, okay, or the rather I would say the justification that how this is of a recent origin. Okay, so this is basically the passage is all about. Okay, so a slightly difficult to read, but still you can actually get the gist of the passage. This is what I believe. Okay, so without me wasting much of the time, let's actually get into the question types. So which of the following best expresses the author's main point? Okay, so now remember this question is related to the author's main point. Okay, so what is the author's main point? It's very clear. I just summarize the author's main point. Okay, so he's saying he's against the, let's say he's against the present day, okay, so he's against the present day philosophers. He's saying that this is not something since antiquity, but the philosophy is actually something which is of a recent origin. And to prove his point, he's actually giving the justification in the second paragraph as well as in the third paragraph. Okay, so let's move on to the option. Philosophy's overriding interest in basic human questions is a legacy primarily work of Kant. Okay, no doubt that this gentleman Kant was being mentioned in the third paragraph, but is this the main point? Was the main point was to highlight the contribution of Kant? So the philosophy's overriding interest in basic human questions is a legacy primarily of the work of Kant. Okay, so while Kant is definitely mentioned in the passage, okay, but the entire passage does not focus on Kant or his work. Okay, this is not the main point of the passage. This is not the main point of the author's. Rather, he uses this particular example of a Kant as a fact to support that the philosophy came as an independent discipline in the 19th century when Kant actually shifted the focus from metaphysics to epistemology. Okay, but this is not the main point. Okay, now philosophy was deeply involved in the 17th century warfare between science and religion. So now the theology was mentioned. No? See the warfare between science and theology when in the 17th century. But again, the question is it a main idea? Okay, this is again a kind of a fact which is true according to the passage, okay, but it is not actually the main idea. So the main idea of the paragraph or the author is not that the philosophy to get into a warfare between science and religion. It is just mentioned in the second paragraph, okay, just to support the authors or just to give the author's justification, just to give the justifications to the author's point of view. Now, the set of problems of primary importance to philosopher has remained relatively constant since antiquity. Now, the set of problems of primary importance to philosophers has remained relatively constant where it is mentioned. It is not mentioned. This is an alien concept, okay? And secondly, it is incorrect also. It is factually incorrect. The reason that it is factually correct is that it never remains constant, okay? So you can say that initially the philosophers were more focused on the metaphysics, but then gradually they actually shifted to epistemology, okay? So he did to replace metaphysics with epistemology, okay? And thus to transform. So it never remains constant. It is factually incorrect and neither it is the main idea, okay? Now, the status of philosophy as an independent intellectual pursuit is a relative recent development, and D is actually the correct answer. Okay, so I'll mark it here. D is the correct answer. This is actually the author's main point. Okay, since the very beginning, he's saying that it is actually a serious misinterpretation of the past, and then and on close examination to be of quite recent origin. Okay, so this is the status of philosophy as a now independent intellectual. This came here, and thus to transform the notion of philosophy as a separate and a functional discipline. And it happens, actually it was mentioned somewhere, when Kant put it together. Okay, that is, the demarcation was facilitated, the demarcation of philosophy from science was facilitated by the development in the early 19th century. Okay, so he's saying this thing, this is actually the main idea. In case if you would have listened to the summary of the passage, okay, you would come to know that this is absolutely correct. Now, the role of philosophy in guiding intellectual speculation has gradually been usurped by science. Okay. Now, usurp is actually, let's understand this word, where you take a particular position by either by using power or something which is done illegally. Okay. So this concept was again not mentioned. Okay. In guiding intellectual has gradually been usurped by science. So this intellectual speculation was mentioned here. This is factually, again, this is factually incorrect. Okay, so he mentioned here that the role of philosophy in guiding intellectual speculation has gradually been usurped by science. That the this particular, they say that the other subjects such as theology or science, okay, they're actually dependent, or rather they say that the philosophy is superior than these intellectual disciplines. Okay, and whose tentative philosophical solution have served as a necessary foundation for which all other speculation has rested. Okay, so they believe that the on philosophy all the other intellectual speculation has rested. They don't believe that this is being usurped by science. Okay, so it is somewhat factually incorrect, and nor it is the main point. Okay, so the question is asking you the main point, and the main point is actually highlighted in the option number D, which is actually correct answer. So I hope you got an idea about this particular question. So let's get into the second question. So the author suggests that Descartes' support for the new science of the 17th century can be characterized as. So we know that this Descartes was mentioned actually in the second paragraph. Okay, so it's the answer actually lies in the second paragraph. But let's read the question carefully. So the author suggests that Descartes' support for the new science of the 17th century can be characterized as. Now, can we see the options? It looks like kind of a tone-based question. Okay. Now, the authors, what is the author's tone towards the Descartes? Okay. So, what is the tone of the authors towards Descartes? So, is he presented the Descartes in a very, let's say, negative manner, in a very angry manner? No. Okay. Did he like was super duper impressed with this Descartes? He was neither super duper impressed. He just gave it in a very, let's say, a pragmatic manner. He just present the Descartes in a practical manner. So let's just look at the options: hypocritical, inconsistent, opportunistic, fleeting, cautious, or pragmatic. Okay, so all these are super negative words. Okay, so hypocritical is a negative word, inconsistent, negative word, opportunistic. Now the person who is an opportunistic is actually a kind of a person who looks for an opportunity, who does not go with the values and all that. Okay, fleeting is just for a very short period of a time. Okay, so all these words are a negative words, and we know that the author has not presented the Descartes in a negative manner. Okay, so the correct answer to this question is option number E, strong but prudent. Okay, now this daring and opportunistic seems to be a very close by option. Okay, but then see, pragmatic, the practical was, the pragmatic part was correct, it was an impressive word. But then again, the problem is with the hypocritical. Okay, cautious is a careful, and inconsistent again negative. Okay, now daring and opportunistic. Now opportunistic is a negative word. First of all, the reason that we could eliminate this thing. Now daring is something that you have faced some negative consequences. Okay, but then again, nothing about the negative consequences, I would rather say, is being mentioned here in this particular passage. Okay, so we cannot say that this particular guy, okay, so there must be some evidence of adverse consequences which is mentioned in it. So we cannot say that this is daring. So it is strong but prudent, and there is a line also which supports here. Okay, so Descartes and Hobbes rejected medieval philosophy. They did not think of themselves as modern philosophers do, as proposing a new and better philosophy, but rather as furthering the warfare between science and theology. They were fighting, albeit discreetly. Okay, now in case if you know, the meaning of the word discreet is synonyms to prudent. Okay, so prudent and discreet. Okay, so in a very careful manner. Okay, which is some like something which is showing the care and thought for the future. Okay, so discreet and prudent are synonyms. Okay, so they were fighting, albeit discreetly, to open the intellectual world to the new science and to liberate intellectual life from ecclesiastical philosophy, and envision their work as a contributing to the growth not of philosophy but of research in mathematics and physics. Okay, so this liberate the intellectual life can say that they were actually strong. Okay, and this then prudent and discreetly, they are actually synonyms to each other. So that is the reason that the correct answer to this question is option number E. Okay, I hope you understand this particular question. Okay, so let's move to the question number 3. So again, the primary function of the passage as a whole is 2. So now the primary function and the main idea, again, the main purpose of the passage, it's kind of the same. Okay, so let's read the option. Okay, so compare two competing models. Are they comparing two competing models? What are those competing models? Nothing about the comparison is mentioned. Nothing is compared. Okay, analyze a difficult theory. But before we understand, let's get into the understanding the meaning of the word analysis. Okay, so analysis is actually a kind of, let's say, a neutral evaluation. Okay, so this passage is not an analytical passage. This passage is actually an argumentative. So in case if you would have listened or like attended my RC's classes, I've discussed the different passages, and this passage is an argumentative. So the author presents his opinion, and in order to support his opinion, he's presenting the facts further. Okay, so this kind of the passage is an argumentating. So it is not analyzing. Analyzing is actually a kind of a neutral evaluation. Okay, present new evidence for a theory. Is he presenting new evidence? Is something like a new evidence? And what theory? Which theory? Okay, it's not mentioned. Now, correct and erroneous belief. Now, erroneous belief, erroneous is actually something which is incorrect. Okay, by describing its origin, and this is actually the correct answer. Okay, so the author is talking about the evolution of a current idea of a philosophy and how this is actually the misrepresentation of a past, misinterpretation of the past. Okay, so he's saying that the philosophy is of a recent origin, whereas the present day philosophers believe that it is since antiquity, it is since very long time. Okay, so he's actually correcting an erroneous view. So he's saying that it develops into a separate and a foundational discipline in the early 19th century. So he's correcting an erroneous belief by describing its origin. Resolve a long-standing theoretical controversy. Now again, what controversies? Okay, and what theoretical controversies is being talked? And is he resolving some controversies? He's not resolving some controversy. There is an opinion by the present-day philosophers. He disagrees with this opinion of the philosopher, and then he's presenting the facts to justify his disagreement. Okay, so that is the case. He's not resolving a long-standing theoretical controversies. Okay, so that makes the option number D the correct answer. The last question of this particular, so according to the passage, the present day philosophers, so now the present day philosophers are being discussed in mostly in the first paragraph. No doubt it has a reference in the second and the third paragraph, but still say believe that mind body problem is an issue. That, so where was this mind body problem? So it is a kind of an anchor based phrase question rather. Okay, so we have to locate this phrase mind body problem, where it was there. Yeah, okay, so the mind body problem. Okay, so we have to actually identify this phrase of a mind body problem, and then let's see which answer option could be relevant to obtain which option could be relevant actually to answer it. Okay, so it occurs in the first para, so we have to actually go to the first paragraph. Okay, so the present day philosophers envision their discipline as an endeavor that has been since antiquity, distinct from and superior to an any intellectual discipline. Where I'm lost. Okay, so to any intellectual discipline such as theology or science, such philosophical concerns as the mind body problem, or more generally the nature of human knowledge, they believe are basic human questions whose tentative philosophical solution has served as the necessary foundation on which all other speculation has rested. Okay, so what they believe, they use this mind body problem as an example of a basic let's say human questions. Okay, and whose solutions, so basic human questions, are related to the mind body problem, and whose solution has actually served as a foundation for the other intellectual speculation. Okay, so let's see, according to the passage, the present day philosophers believe that the mind body is a problem. Problem is an issue that has implication primarily for philosophers. So is it primarily for philosophers? So they believe that its application has the necessary foundations on which all other intellectual speculation has rested. Okay, so not only primarily for philosophers, may be affected by the recent advances in science. So nothing about this may be affected by the recent advances in science is being mentioned here. Okay, has shaped recent work in epistemology. Now we know that the epistemology was actually mentioned in the this epistemology yeah, it was mentioned in the third paragraph, and then this mind body problem was being talked in the first paragraph. Okay, has little relevance to the present day philosophy. Now this is incorrect. Okay, because this is the opinion of the present day philosophers. In case if it has little relevance, then why would they have glorified it that philosophy has served as a necessary foundation on which all other intellectual speculation has rested? So they have presented this thing as a positive. So this is not a little relevance. Okay, and has served as a basis for intellectual speculation since equity and antiquity. This is actually the correct answer. Okay, so I'll just clear the drawings and then I'll just get back to this. Okay, so it is present day philosophers since antiquity. So such philosophical concerns as the mind body problem, or more generally the nature of human knowledge, they believe are basic human questions whose tentative philosophical solution have served as a necessary foundation on which all other intellectual speculation has rested. Okay, so has served as a basis for intellectual speculation since antiquity is actually the correct answer. Okay, so by this we have done with the questions of the para 1, passage 1. I hope you are there with me. Okay.